I'm Natalie Brooks, and for most of my life, I thought loyalty was the same as love. That belief shattered the day my parents told me to pack my things and leave the house I had just bought for them. It happened in our living room in Boulder with the afternoon sun falling across the floor. I'd chosen the curtains, I'd hung the home I believed was ours. My father sat quietly while my mother avoided my eyes. The words came out soft, almost gentle, but they cut through everything I'd built. You should let your sister and the kids stay here, Natalie. They need it more than you do. For a second, I thought I'd misheard. My name was still on every document, my savings had gone into every brick, yet they spoke as if it belonged to someone else. I asked calmly, "Are you asking me to leave my own house?" My mother sighed, almost irritated. "Emma's been through so much. You don't have children. You'll be fine." There was nothing left to say. I packed the essentials into my car, the same car that carried me to every open house when I worked overtime to afford that mortgage. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I simply turned the key, looked once at the windows I had cleaned that morning, and drove away. What they didn't know was that silence can hold more power than rage. 1 week after my sister settled in, she fainted when she saw a man standing in the kitchen of what she thought was her new home. Before we dive in, tell me, what time is it, where you are, and which city are you watching from? I'd love to know how far this story has traveled. Before houses and money, there was already a gap between us. I remember Boulder not for its mountains or cold mornings, but for the small house where everything began to feel uneven. My sister Emma was the center of every conversation, the one whose laughter filled every room. Mom always said she had a spark, something that made people adore her. I was the quiet one, the helper who washed dishes, cleaned the yard, and stayed out of the way. While Emma got to choose what to watch on TV, I was asked to check if the laundry was dry. It never felt unfair back then, just the way things were. Emma loved people. She joined every club at school, spent weekends at sleepovers, and always came home with stories about friends and parties. Mom smiled at every word she said. Dad laughed at her jokes, even when they weren't funny. I learned early that attention was something you had to earn, so I tried to be useful. I did my homework on time, kept my grades perfect, and got my first part-time job at a diner when I was 16. When I came home late, smelling like coffee and grease, Mom would sigh, saying, "You work too hard, sweetheart. You're too serious." At dinner, the difference between us grew louder than words. Emma talked about outfits and school dances while I spoke about my classes or saving for college. Mom's eyes followed Emma's hands as she talked, not mine. When she got her first car for her birthday, I told myself it was fine because she was older. When I got mine, I paid for it in monthly installments. Dad said he was proud, but added that he couldn't help with the payments since Emma's bills were piling up again. College didn't change much. I attended the state university an hour away, majoring in business. I thought leaving home might balance things out, but even then the phone calls came. "Your sister's rent is late," Mom said. "Could you help us this month?" I always said yes. Sometimes I skipped meals just to send a bit more money back. Emma was going through a rough patch, they said. It was always a rough patch that somehow lasted years. When I came home during breaks, Emma was usually out shopping or meeting friends. The house stayed the same except for the wall filled with her framed photos and certificates. Mine were in a drawer somewhere. I didn't mind at first. I told myself I was different, that my place in the family was to be stable, not celebrated. Yet every time I saw them gather around her stories, a quiet ache grew in me. By the time I graduated, Emma had already dropped out of her art program. She said she wanted to find herself, and my parents nodded as if that were noble. When I got my first job, they clapped, but didn't come to the ceremony. "It's just work," Dad said. "We'll celebrate when your sister figures things out." I smiled, pretending it didn't sting. Years went by, and I stopped expecting fairness. I visited home less often, partly because of my schedule, and partly because it hurt to sit at that dinner table where love seemed rationed out in portions. My mother once told me, "We know you'll be fine. You always are." It sounded like a compliment, but it felt like a wall. Looking back, the distance between Emma and me wasn't just made of miles or choices. It was built out of years of small differences, unspoken comparisons, and a belief that I didn't need what she did. I learned to live without asking for more, to stay quiet when things hurt. Maybe that's why when everything finally fell apart, silence came to me so easily. Love in our family never felt equal. A few months ago, I finally had something that was mine. After years of saving and working extra hours, I closed the deal on a small house on the north side of Boulder. It wasn't fancy, but it was solid, quiet, and filled with light that spilled through the windows every morning. I worked in real estate, so I had seen hundreds of houses, yet this one felt different. It felt like a place where peace could grow. I signed the papers, held the keys in my hand, and thought about my parents. They had spent their lives in rented places, moving whenever the rent increased. I wanted to give them something steady, something they could finally call home. When I invited them to move in, they looked at me as if I had just given them the world. Mom cried and hugged me for a long time. Dad said it was too much, but I could tell he was proud. For the first few weeks, life felt like the balance I had chased for years. Mom filled the kitchen with the smell of coffee every morning. Dad worked in the garden, and I returned home from the office to laughter coming from the living room. Then Emma called. Her voice was thin, almost trembling. She said the divorce had gone through, that her husband had left her with nothing but the kids. I heard the strain in her words when she asked, "Could we stay with you for just a few weeks until I figure things out?" I looked around the living room, the framed photos of Mom and Dad smiling, the plants thriving by the window. Part of me hesitated, but Mom's eyes lit up the moment she heard Emma's name. "We'll all be together again," she said. That sentence carried a warmth I hadn't heard in years, and before I could think too much, I agreed. Emma arrived the following weekend with 2 small suitcases, her son Eli holding a stuffed dinosaur, and her daughter Nora clutching a pink blanket. Mom fussed over them, making hot chocolate and pulling out extra pillows. Emma smiled weakly, thanking everyone as if she were a guest, but something in her tone already carried ownership. She said, "This place is perfect for the kids," while walking from room to room, peeking into closets and opening drawers. I told myself it was only curiosity, but the way she placed her handbag on the counter and started rearranging the kitchen made me uneasy. Still, I stayed quiet. I didn't want to ruin the fragile harmony that had just begun. For a while, things stayed calm. We ate dinners together, talked about old family stories, and even laughed about our childhood fights. Eli and Nora played in the yard while Dad watched from his chair, pretending not to get emotional. Mom kept saying, "This is what I always wanted," as if that simple picture could erase years of imbalance. I tried to believe it too, but as the days passed, Emma's presence grew louder. She began leaving her laundry in the hallway, using my office desk for her phone calls, and deciding what groceries we needed. She told Mom to move her plants because they blocked the light, and said the living room needed a softer look. One night, I came home to find she had invited her friends over for dinner without telling me. The smell of food filled the house, but it didn't feel like mine anymore. The tension was silent but constant. I started staying late at work just to avoid walking into that new version of my home. Mom seemed happier than ever, talking about how nice it was to have everyone together again. She didn't see how I was shrinking in my own space, how I was starting to feel like the guest. One evening, when Emma laughed from the couch and called out, "Nat, can you grab me a glass of water?" I realized something inside me had shifted. The peace I had built was slipping through my hands, replaced by a feeling I knew too well, the quiet ache of being invisible. 3 months later, my name was still on the papers, but my opinion didn't count. What had once been my home now looked like a stranger's project. The living room, once painted soft ivory, had turned into a storm of pastel blues and yellows. Emma said it was for the kids, that Eli and Nora deserved a cheerful space. She moved the couch to face the opposite wall, replaced my wooden coffee table with a plastic one covered in glitter stickers, and filled the shelves with toys. I came home one evening to find my bookshelf gone and a play tent in its place. When I asked where it was, Emma smiled and said, "I put it in the garage. The kids need space to play." Mom nodded approvingly, saying it looked livelier that way. Every week brought a new change. The guest room became a playroom. My office turned into a shared craft corner. Even the kitchen looked different with cartoon magnets and colorful drawings taped to the fridge. When I hesitated at the doorway, Mom would remind me, "It's still family's house. We all share it." She said it with love, as if it were an act of unity, but to me, the words felt like a slow erasure of boundaries. I was still paying the mortgage, yet my decisions had quietly disappeared into the background noise of family comfort. One Sunday afternoon, I came home to find Emma painting the hallway mint green. There were open paint cans on the floor, drops splattered across the tiles, and music blasting from her phone. I stood there holding my grocery bag while she hummed, hair tied up messily, wearing one of my old t-shirts. When I asked why she hadn't told me, she shrugged. "The kids deserve color. It feels happier this way." Mom appeared behind me, wiping her hands on a towel, and added, "She's right, honey. A little color doesn't hurt anyone." I wanted to remind them that the house wasn't theirs to repaint, that decisions like this should be discussed, but the words stuck somewhere between my chest and my throat. I was tired of sounding defensive in a home that was supposed to be mine. Later that week, I brought up finances. Sitting at the dining table, I explained that property taxes had gone up and that I was the only one covering them. I mentioned how utilities were higher since 4 more people were living here. Before I could finish, Mom interrupted, her expression tightening. "You're being selfish, Natalie. Your sister just went through a divorce and you're talking about money." I looked at her stunned, trying to understand how helping my own family had turned into a moral flaw. Emma stayed quiet, eyes lowered in a performance of guilt that I recognized all too well. Dad avoided my gaze, fiddling with his glasses. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. Over the next few months, I stopped trying to set boundaries. The house had become something I tiptoed through. Emma's laughter filled the evenings, blending with the sound of cartoons and the clatter of dishes. My parents adored having the children around, saying it made them feel young again. They didn't notice how my routines had shrunk to the corners of my room. I started eating dinner at work, claiming late meetings, and only returned home when the lights were off. The space that once grounded me now felt like a museum of my absence. One evening in early spring, Mom asked me to join them in the living room. Her tone was unusually formal, and that alone made my stomach twist. Dad sat beside her, hands folded neatly, while Emma pretended to be busy sorting papers on the coffee table. Mom cleared her throat and said, "We've been thinking, sweetheart. Emma needs stability for the kids. You're young, independent, and can manage on your own. Maybe it's time you rented a place closer to your office." I didn't speak. My fingers tightened around the edge of my chair. They looked at me with a kind of gentle pity, as if I were a guest who had overstayed. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the wall clock. I searched their faces for any sign of hesitation, but all I saw was comfort in their decision. Emma didn't even look up. It was as if the sentence had already been decided long before tonight. My name was still on the deed, yet it meant nothing. I could have shouted, demanded fairness, reminded them who paid for the walls around us. But instead I stood, walked quietly to my room, and began folding my clothes into a suitcase. I didn't cry, and I didn't argue. As I zipped the bag shut, a strange calm settled over me. The house hummed with distant laughter, the kind that once made me feel safe. Now it only reminded me of how easily love can rewrite ownership. Before leaving, I took one last look at the mint green walls, the scattered toys, the curtains Emma had chosen. It all looked warm and full of life, yet I felt nothing but cold detachment. I didn't argue. I just started planning. When they left for their week-long trip, I decided it was time. Emma had been talking about taking the kids to Florida for months, and when the car finally pulled away from the driveway that morning, the silence that followed was sharper than any argument. For the first time in half a year, the house was mine again. I walked through each room, slowly running my hand across the walls. She had painted the furniture, she had replaced the spaces that had once reflected me. The air smelled faintly of her perfume and vanilla candles. It should have felt lonely, but it didn't. It felt like clarity. The next day, I met with a lawyer downtown. Her office was filled with framed degrees and the scent of strong coffee. I explained the situation calmly, sliding a folder across her desk that contained the property deed, the mortgage records, and every receipt that had my name printed on it. She read through them, nodding slowly before saying, "Legally, you are the sole owner, Ms. Brooks. No one can remove you without your consent." Hearing that sentence was like breathing fresh air after months underground. It wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming what I had already earned. I left her office with a plan forming in my mind, precise and quiet. That afternoon, I contacted an appraiser. He arrived the next morning, clipboard in hand, walking through the house with professional detachment. "Good bones, excellent neighborhood," he said, noting the upgrades I had made before everything changed. When he handed me the estimate, I knew the number by heart before I even read it. I went back to my car, sat for a while, and then opened my laptop. Within an hour, the house was listed for sale. 2 days later, I met Callum Warren, a civil engineer who had just transferred to Boulder for a new project. He was polite, well-spoken, and carried an air of calm that I hadn't felt in months. When he stepped into the living room, he looked around with genuine admiration. "It's rare to find a place this well kept," he said. I almost laughed, thinking of the chaos that had filled it just days earlier. We walked through every room together, and when he paused by the window overlooking the garden, he said quietly, "This feels like a home someone loved." For the first time, I realized how much truth there was in that. By Friday, we were sitting in the same lawyer's office again. The paperwork was ready, clean and final. I signed my name carefully, watching the ink dry on the line that once symbolized hope and now meant freedom. Callum signed next, smiling faintly. "I'll take good care of it," he said. I believed him. When the lawyer slid the final copy across the desk, I felt the weight that had been pressing on my chest for months finally lift. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the Rockies, I stood outside the house for the last time. The windows reflected the fading gold light, and for a moment I remembered all the mornings I had stood there dreaming about giving my parents stability. The irony was almost poetic. I took one photo not for nostalgia, but as proof that endings can be quiet too. Back in my car, I opened my laptop, typed a short email, and sent it to my family's shared inbox. Ownership transfer completed. No explanations, no apologies. I drove out of Boulder that night, the city lights fading behind me. I didn't know where I was heading, only that I needed distance. The road stretched ahead, wide and empty, and for the first time in a long while, I wasn't running from anyone. I was simply moving toward peace. 1 week later, when they came back, nothing looked familiar anymore. I wasn't there, but I could imagine every second as clearly as if I had been standing behind the curtains watching. The car would pull into the driveway just before sunset, Florida sand still clinging to the tires. Emma would step out first, sunglasses in her hair, her voice calling for the kids to grab their bags. My parents would follow behind, tired but cheerful, certain they were returning to the same home they had left behind. What they didn't know was that home no longer belonged to them. When they reached the front door, Emma probably noticed first that the lock didn't resist her key. The door would open too easily, the smell of coffee would drift from the kitchen, and the lights, still on, would scatter across the floor like a warning. In the middle of the kitchen, Callum Warren stood quietly, a mug in his hand. He told me later that he had been making coffee when the sound of the key startled him. He turned and saw a woman, 2 kids, and an older couple staring at him as if he were a ghost. Emma demanded to know what he was doing there. When he told her he was the new owner, she screamed, stumbled backward, and fainted. My father called me less than 5 minutes later. His voice trembled between disbelief and anger. "Natalie, there's a man in your house. He says he owns it. I kept my tone even. That's because he does. Everything was legal. There was silence on the line. Then my mother's voice broke in high and frantic. How could you do this to your sister? She has children. I closed my eyes, took a breath, and said I did nothing to her. I just stopped doing everything for her. Before they could reply, I hung up. Later, Callum called to tell me what happened after. My parents sat on the couch in shock while he tried to calm them down. He explained politely that the sale had gone through all legal channels, that the deed now carried his name, and that a letter from my lawyer would arrive within the hour confirming the transfer. He even offered them water before stepping aside to give them space. I smiled faintly when he told me that, even in chaos, he had manners. That evening, as the sun disappeared behind the Rockies, an envelope slid through the front door. Inside was the official notice: 14 days to remove their belongings. I had written that condition intentionally, not out of cruelty, but because I wanted to give them enough time to understand what consequence looked like. My parents had spent years defending Emma's carelessness, convincing themselves it was love. I used to believe that too, until I realized love without respect is just guilt dressed nicely. I didn't go back to see their faces. I didn't need to. I could already picture the disbelief, the shaking hands, the whispers of why. But deep down, they knew why. They had watched me build everything I had, brick by brick, hour by hour, yet they treated it as something I owed. The moment they told me to leave my own house, they made their choice. I simply made mine. That night, I sat by my window in Denver, the city glowing in the distance. I thought about how strange it felt to find peace in silence. No yelling, no accusations, just the quiet hum of a new beginning. My phone buzzed once, a message from my lawyer confirming the delivery of the notice. I stared at the screen for a moment, then turned it off. I didn't feel guilt or triumph or revenge. I felt something simpler. Freedom. People might say I went too far, but they didn't live through the years of small betrayals that led here. They didn't hear the words that made me feel like a guest in my own life. So when I finally walked away, it wasn't cruelty, it was clarity. No, I didn't betray my family. I finally stopped betraying myself. A few months later, Boulder's cold mornings didn't feel heavy anymore. I had learned to love their quiet rhythm, the way the air bit gently at my cheeks. As I walked to the cafe near my apartment, the steam from my coffee fogging the window while the city woke up around me. Life had slowed down, and for the first time in years, the stillness didn't scare me. My apartment was small, but bright, tucked close to the city center where everything felt within reach, yet peacefully distant from the noise of my past. I worked as a freelance designer, picking my projects carefully, spending long afternoons surrounded by sunlight, sketchbooks, and the hum of my old laptop. There was no pressure to please, no one waiting to judge how I spent my hours. It felt like breathing freely after holding my breath for too long. I didn't hear from my family much after that week. My parents stayed in Boulder but chose silence, as if pretending I didn't exist would undo what had happened. Maybe they didn't know what to say, or maybe they did, but couldn't bear to face the truth that I had finally acted like someone who knew her worth. I used to check my phone, half expecting a message from my mother, but the screen always stayed blank. Over time, I stopped looking. Peace can be strange at first. It's quiet, almost too quiet, until one day you realize that quiet is what healing sounds like. Emma lost her job 2 months after the house was sold. A mutual acquaintance mentioned it casually over coffee, unaware of the history between us. She's been struggling since the move, they said. Rents are insane right now. I think she's staying in some old duplex on the edge of town. I nodded, offering nothing more. There was a time when that news would have broken me, when I would have rushed to help, called, offered money, or found solutions she didn't deserve. But now I simply felt nothing sharp. Nothing cruel, just distance. She had built her tower of entitlement high enough. I had only stopped climbing it. My parents didn't ask me to visit for the holidays. They probably knew I wouldn't. Instead, I sent birthday cards for Emma's kids, small notes, written in careful handwriting, never signed, with anything more than Aunt Natalie. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a quiet gesture of hope that maybe someday they would understand there was still love, even if it now came from afar. One morning in early March, I woke up to an email from Callum Warren. The subject line read, "Your house." I opened it expecting something formal about paperwork, but inside was a single sentence. "Your house is happy now," and a photo. The garden was in full bloom, tulips lining the path I once walked barefoot, the light spilling over the porch like a soft memory. The sight didn't sting. It warmed me. I realized the house had never really been about ownership. It had been a mirror of me, neglected, misused, then finally reclaimed and given a chance to breathe again. That night, as snow fell lightly outside my window, I sat by the heater with my sketchbook on my lap and whispered to myself, "You did the right thing." For the first time, I truly believed it. Freedom wasn't loud or dramatic. It was this: the sound of wind outside, and the calm of knowing I didn't owe anyone anything more. Sometimes loving your family means learning when to walk away. I learned that endless giving doesn't build love. It only builds expectation. Boundaries aren't walls. They're doors that open to peace. And peace, I finally understood, isn't given, it's chosen. Thank you for listening till the very end. I hope my story reminds you that choosing peace isn't selfish, it's survival. What would you have done in my place? Share your thoughts below. I read every single one.